Hello, today we're telling a story of community resistance and solidarity. And we begin that story at a former bowling club in Glasgow's south side. 166 years after the Kingston Bowling Club opened, this site began a transformation into a different kind of community hub for a different kind of community. Nowadays, it's a thriving urban common, a space that hosts activities designed to foster well-being, strengthen the community ties and provide much-needed green space for the richly diverse residents of Pollokshields. And our situation here is important. The bowling green is on the corner of Kenmure Street. Back in May, this street became world famous when a community protest disrupted a Home Office raid to remove 2 people suspected of immigration violations. At the heart of the protest was a memorable act of solidarity. Local residents and immigration activists demanded peacefully but emphatically that the detainees were part of the community. And in an unprecedented move, the 2 men, aided by human rights lawyer Amar Anwar, were released from a police van marooned in a sea of people back into the heart of Pollokshields.
The Home Office has agreed to these 2 individuals being released into the safe custody of myself. The police will form a cordon when they are released from the van. What I'm asking you, and this is serious, right, because otherwise, all bets are off. We have an agreement, it is in writing, these men will be released safely, they will not be arrested, there will be no enforcement action against them, and I have an agreement that the police will form a cordon around the van with myself and the 2 men, and then we will be walked to the mosque where they will be released. I would ask everyone to keep a distance, and once they are released into the mosque, for everyone to then disperse so that the vans, the horses, the police officers can disperse from this community. Everyone in this community should be extremely proud of what we have achieved.
I'm Anne Kerr. Welcome to Recovering Community, the podcast about communities, how they're built, broken and remade. It's summer 2021 and Kenmure Street is back to its usual peaceful self. But one thing that really struck me about the portrayal of the May protest was how it was framed as part of Glasgow's long history of people power. So how does activism and community in Glasgow figure in relation to belonging and borders, be that in the UK or Scotland? To talk about that, I'm joined by my colleagues Cetta Mainwaring and Teresa Piacentini, who've been researching migration and community activism, as well as taking part in activities that support migrants in the city. I'm also very happy to welcome Pinar Aksu, Development Officer at Maryhill Integration Network, and David Millar, a Kenmure Street resident. Let's begin with some context. I asked Teresa about the Kenmure Street protest.
The Kenmure Street dawn raid took place, a few minutes up the road from here. And it's an interesting place to start because what Kenmure Street for me represents is the kind of culmination of 20 years of activism, solidarity and protest in the city of Glasgow. I was sitting at home working and I was checking on my Twitter account and I saw a notice from the Anti-AIDS Network saying there's an immigration detention van in Kenmure Street, get down there if you can. So literally chucked some trainers on, grabbed my keys and went down, and that was maybe about 10:30 in the morning. And at that point there was already the police van there, some police presence, about 20 folk, and the Anti-AIDS Network activists were already under the van. And that was the start of what became a very long day, culminating with something which I have never seen in the 20 years that I've worked in this area, of immigration officers backing down and releasing somebody back into the community. So it was really very remarkable on lots of different levels.
There was a huge amount of media interest in it, and I'm interested in your own experiences from actually being there on the day and what kinds of people were there with you, particularly people maybe who hadn't been to that kind of event or protest in the past. Could you reflect for me about that, please?
what's often the case at these kinds of moments is you see the usual suspects. So there's lots of people you recognise, and that's very comforting and important and has a real value. But what is also really important to see lots of faces that you wouldn't normally see. I think, again, the fact that it took place in this community meant that our neighbours and our friends who live in Kenmure Street flats were out there as well. And I think that there was a shock that it happens on their doorstep.
I'm David Millar, and I live immediately beside the site of the Kenmure Street Protest that happened outside my window. And I was sitting in my kitchen when I heard the first protesters' cries outside in the street. Well, it's a kind of thing you don't really expect to happen outside your window. I was literally sitting in my kitchen and thinking, what's that noise? I came through and suddenly saw this what looked rather dystopian scene of about 20 policemen, all kind of like dressed in skip caps, completely still, encircling a van. It was really weird.
So I do think that it opened people's eyes a little bit to what the Home Office is capable of. And in that sense, it was really valuable because it showed the kind of violence that the Home Office is capable of, and disregard for human rights, disrespect for the Scottish Government. There's no coincidence it happened on the day that they were getting sworn in, which made it very difficult for the Scottish Government to get a hold of people in Westminster. But I think for me what's been really interesting is the conversations I've had since with people who I may have wondered about their views on immigration, if I'm being perfectly honest, being kind of shocked about what happened. And I hope then it was a teachable moment for them to understand that the immigration enforcement does happen to your neighbours, the people that you see, that you say hello to at the bus stops, that you see, walking up and down your street, and that no one is safe unless we're all safe, is a really important message. That, for me, is one that came out really strongly that day.
The spread of information was actually really interesting because, I think what precipitated a lot of people's involvement initially was that it was Eid al-Fitr, and it's, we're at the centre of the Pakistani community in Scotland. And around this area, there's a real kind of expectancy in the run up to Eid. There's a lot of folk, getting together, they're going out, getting food in for family celebrations. So it was just looking out and thinking, well, do you guys actually know, what community you're in and what day it is? And it seemed inappropriate. And generally people looked out of their windows and saw something in their street that they thought was wrong. And they decided that they would go and do something about it.
I want to introduce Pinar Aksu. Pinar is a campaigner and a development officer with the Maryhill Integration Network, an organisation founded to bring asylum seekers, migrants and refugees together with the settled inhabitants of Glasgow. And Pinar felt the build-up to Kenmure Street.
I guess for me, it started a month before in April when one of our members at Maryhill Integration Network, he experienced dawn raid in the morning. And he was, he's 67 years old, and we learned that the immigration officers came to their house and he panicked, and because he had a heart condition, he had to be taken to the hospital. From there, then we kind of did an outlet of asking all the networks, asking all the integration groups and everyone else in the city to say, this happened to one of our members. Is this something that has been going on for a while? And then we ended up finding out that actually a few more cases happened since last year of 2020 towards the end. And then I guess from there, the networks and groups were starting to mobilise in terms of what to do or what happens when a dawn raid takes place.
For most, the excitement of the protest was swept away in the next day's news cycle. But for local residents, it took some getting used to. And David Millar felt compelled to act.
The day after, it was really quite surreal because it was so quiet. And I think I took a photograph 24 hours from the protest just to show how quiet the street was. And interestingly, people after the protest cleared up all the rubbish and took it away. It was because it's our home, our community, and we looked after our street as well as our neighbours. But I think what didn't dawn on people, particularly people who were very close to the protest itself, it's actually just, it's really quite stressful having a shouting crowd and, and many policemen, police vans, police horses sort of in your community. And I think it took, a couple of days for people to kind of come down from that. One of the things that I think was helpful was that you may know that a spokesperson for the Home Office characterised the protest as a mob, which, I think a lot of people were quite aggrieved by, bearing in mind that the protests had been supported by our MSP, the First Minister, our MP, and also the Justice Minister for Scotland. And somebody in the street printed out some leaflets, stuck them around the closes on Friday, suggesting that we come out on Saturday at noon, with some banners and to make it clear that we were not a mob. And that was the genesis of our community group, Not a Mob. We had clandestine meetings in the bus shelter that you might have seen beside the immigration van. We kind of called it the People's Bus Shelter. And I'm thinking of writing to the council to see if we can have the name changed, since actually we don't have a bus. Yeah, so it was really just a case, particularly of people who weren't involved in other refugee or international organisations. I think what we realised quite soon afterwards was that, there are a lot of people, and actually this is really fundamental to the day. The reason the protest really worked was that there are a lot of really committed activists who mobilised very quickly to resist the Home Office's actions. And, I was involved in a number of anti-racist organisations when I was a student, but haven't really over the last, obviously, 20 years. And really, didn't have an up-to-date understanding of exactly how malign the legislation had got. So I think, what we decided to do was we wanted not to replicate what other organisations were doing, but we're looking at ways of raising some money and raising awareness using the background of Kenmure Street to kind of keep the flame alive.
And the power of the community reaction inspired other activists across the country. Here's Teresa.
The night after the Kenmure Street incident, the anti-raid networks have been really involved in training people to know what to do when they see an immigration enforcement van in their neighbourhoods. But the night after, I attended an online session organised by Haringey Anti-Raids Network, and that was really fascinating because they said normally they have maybe 20 or 30 folk that come, and that night there were 200 people signed up, and they kept referencing Kenmure Street and they kept referencing Glasgow, and all the questions in the chat, because it was an online event, was all about how can we do what we did in Glasgow. And I think what it did, it put fire in people's bellies, particularly people who feel that and look on and see the injustice but just don't know really what's required, what do I need to do, how do I connect in. So what I could also see in the chat were people connecting across different English cities and neighbourhoods. And so I think that Kenmure Street is being held up really as kind of an ultimate act of solidarity against the Home Office, but a real learning moment for people to think, what can I do differently? And particularly so for younger activists coming through now, because if we've been doing it for 20 years, there's a lot of learning and knowledge we can share, but actually it's also changed. The landscape has changed quite radically as well.
I don't know, it was weird. I kind of felt a responsibility, since it had kind of happened literally outside my door, to do something. And because of the fact that we couldn't meet together because of COVID, I thought, well, how do we kind of capture people and to actually make sure that we keep in touch with people who were motivated to get involved? So I got the website going and decided that a good thing to do would be to have some kind of survey, just so that we could, collect some feedback on what people thought about the day. I think one of the questions was, give me 3 words, about what you felt about the day, just to give a kind of an essence of people's involvement, and then think about an image, that you might be able to share, and also tell us what skills you have that you might be able to offer to any campaign. And at that point, we really didn't know what we were going to do. Were we going to be a campaign group? Were we going to raise money? Were we going to, it's difficult to to know from a standing start. And I thought it might be useful to be able to share that information with, elected representatives and other bodies, just to be able to give some kind of feedback. But it was really just to have something, a stake in the ground of an organisation that was going to do something in the future. But the other interesting thing is that, I've lived around here for about 6 or 7 years, that Pollokshields and the multi-ethnic community that it is has suffered a number of onslaughts from, right-wing and racist organisations and has dealt with them. And the community is resilient. So in some respects, the protest was a predictable response in many ways. And that's me learning more about the history of the community. And, people were talking about, remembering when, as the police horses were cantering around the grass at the end of the road, people were talking about when police horses were deployed during the Govanhill Baths dispute years ago. So there is a kind of a community memory of things, and one that I've been learning about since the protest itself.
There's so much to ask about with the different contexts, both in terms of the past and how we've got to this point, but also about how things have changed since that episode, but more generally too. So maybe just to turn to the past and the context a bit more, and to bring Cetta in as well. What is it that's perhaps particular about Glasgow as a place where these forms of solidarity come to the fore?
That's a really good question about what is it about Glasgow, and it's something we kind of wrestle with in our research and our teaching and in our conversations. I think Glasgow's really long history of activism and solidarity, not necessarily just about migration, but about class and rights and social injustice, is something that lays a really important foundation. And if we look back to dispersal when it happened in 2000, the people that were involved in setting up, for example, the Glasgow campaign to welcome refugees, they were long-standing activists in Glasgow. There's these kind of historical experiences of and understandings of what it means to be, marginalised, vulnerabilised by the state, excluded, and I think that really lays those really important foundations.
Yeah, I think the Kenmure Street Protest I watched online from Edinburgh. I was in Edinburgh.
This is my colleague, Cetta Mainwaring. She researches the movements of migrants, particularly in the Mediterranean.
And it was an incredibly powerful moment of the community coming together, and this moment when border controls and migration controls, the violence inherent in them is visible, I think, which it's often invisible, made invisible by the state. And so it was an important moment in that sense, and a very powerful one in seeing all these people on the street resisting this violent police presence and being successful in it, also something that doesn't happen often. But I think what maybe wasn't as visible watching it online was this longer history of activism that Pinar, Maryhill Integration Network, other groups have been involved in since 2000 at least, but again builds on this longer history of activism around inequality and injustice. And I think that's, to me, maybe this confluence of factors in Glasgow of activists working on different issues, from housing, from poverty, from migration issues, that all connect in different ways. And that connection often isn't made by academics or activists, or normal people don't see those connections, this idea that if one of us isn't safe, we're all not safe. And so I think that history, although, yes, often romanticized and mythologized, is a really powerful platform on which to carry on with activism and resistance in this way.
Could I just maybe add, it's an important point about the history of immigration in Glasgow as well, because we're in Pollokshields, just across, 5 minutes, 10-minute walk away, we're in Govanhill. And Govanhill has a long history of different immigrant populations moving in and moving out. So when I was growing up in Govanhill, it was a largely Irish community that was there, and as somebody from an Italian background, we were the outsiders. And then the Irish were replaced by the Asian population that then moved to kind of Pollokshields. Now what we have are a predominantly East European and Roma community in Govan Hill. So there are lots of stories about the movement of people in the city of Glasgow, which I think feeds into these questions of how we address inequality identity, what it means to be a Glaswegian and who gets to make that claim to be a Glaswegian, which I think is a very important question that we shouldn't take for granted, but definitely feeds into these stories about the city. Whose is the city, right? In Kenmure Street, we were saying these are our neighbours, these are our streets, these are our homes. So, who makes claims to belonging to the city is a really important question to reflect on as well.
I'm glad you mentioned Govan Hill, because I did want to ask as well about the other side to this, really, which is, something that we don't celebrate about Glasgow. It's the sectarianism, it's maybe also racism, it's hostility to different kinds of identities, and it's also linked to a kind of British nationalism in some cases, which is in tension with some ideas about Scottish nationalism. So what would you say about that other side, because that's a community too, right? How does it intersect with the kinds of communities that we maybe think more warmly towards?
This is a really important question about the dark side, right, of community. Because this notion of community means that people belong to it, but also forcibly people don't belong, right? They're on the outside. There has to be a boundary for any kind of community, and that's something you have to grapple with. I mean, if you think back to, 2000, when dispersal happened across Glasgow, in the different neighbourhoods in Glasgow, there was a lot of racism and there was a lot of animosity and a lot of hostility, not just locally from people, but also in service provision. I worked for a long time as a community interpreter, so I was in and out of lots of hospitals and doctor surgeries, and the comments I would hear from reception staff, flippant comments from people sitting waiting, it was racism there, and there still is racism without a doubt. So I think we need to move away from there is no racism in Scotland, there's no racism in Glasgow, we know there is. But I think that over the years there's been a lot of learning, and that's been through a lot of the hard work of organisations like MIN, like the integration networks, but also the more positive pro-immigration message that comes through the political rhetoric from the Scottish Government.
Pinar sees these issues play out on a daily basis in her work with the Maryhill Integration Network.
Just on the question about what community is and the idea about community, I would say, especially for Maryhill, Maryhill is considered to be an area where there's ongoing issues around poverty and its own rights. So when you bring new members of communities, obviously you can't avoid but to have some issues or concerns, and I think that's why we need to have dialogues and conversations and engage with who's in the community, because if we don't know the neighbours who are coming in, that's where the local community starts thinking about, who are these people? They're just coming to our community, they're taking our houses, they're going to take our jobs. These are the things that we hear over the years again and again, and the label that's given to people who are seeking asylum and refuge.
Yeah, I think that the darker sides of community, the racism that we see, in some ways unsurprising when you have racist policies, migration policies informed by Britain's colonial histories, that you would expect then to have some racist response. And to me, this is always a struggle, right, between people who see things differently, who are trying to resist those racist policies. And those tensions that we've been talking about, I think, are exacerbated by not only migration policies that disperse people into areas that are already poor, that are already deprived, but also other policies that have undermined working class conditions in this country for many decades now. And so it's building, sort of layering on those inequalities and injustices. And we can see how some of the UK Home Office's policies, like detention, like trying to detain people offshore now, all of that is an attempt to cut these ties in communities, to make more invisible the violence of migration controls. Kenmure Street demonstrated just how powerful a community can be.
گل پامچال بیرون بیه بیرون
Dispersal is at its very core about disintegration. It is about segregation. And this is why it is so effective as a policy. So in the same day as Kenmure Street, there was another person that was detained, another man that was detained elsewhere. And I think, if I'm correct, he was somebody who was homeless and who'd presented at a homeless shelter. Now, what that tells you is that somebody who's embedded locally with neighbours is somebody who's connected. Somebody who is made homeless as a result of racist Home Office policies is somebody who the Home Office has achieved their goal. They have disconnected this person and they made it impossible for them, or very difficult for them, to keep connected, to get the solidarity and support. So I don't think we can emphasise enough the segregatory nature of dispersal and what it has set out to achieve. And so Maryhill Integration Network, Govan Community Project, South East Integration Network, what they are an act of resistance in and of themselves, because they connect people together. And it's not just integration networks, but it's also Unity Centre, Glasgow Campaign to Welcome Refugees, the Living Rent campaign around the Circle lock changes, which was about Circle, who was a housing provider, forcing people, changing their locks and forcing them out of their house if they were considered to be appeals rights exhausted, so at the end of their asylum process. So what you have are lots of different campaigns and organisations that absolutely have to survive based on their connectedness, their social networks, and dispersal was about doing everything it possibly could for that not to happen.
So listening to you speak, I'm really struck by the emphasis on the work that it takes to keep, I guess, remaking a community and keep reinvigorating it and keeping it going. But at the same time, there's another set of work going on elsewhere around these imagined versions of communities too, which I want to turn to now. And first of all, maybe to just look at this idea of British identity and how that figures in the work you do. Is it something that is seen as, slightly comical or laughable or objectionable, or does it actually have any resonance with the kinds of things that you're trying to achieve for your communities?
No, that's the sense of British identity. It's an interesting question. I don't feel it. It doesn't feature in anything I do. And I think that's maybe because I'm Scottish. I'm from Glasgow. I definitely, to me, it's about the people who are here in Scotland now. It's not to say that it doesn't, the British aspect of it doesn't count. It does, because of how immigration is reserved to Westminster. So we have to be attentive to British politics in that sense. But for me, maybe that sounds like an extreme response, but British identity isn't a feature. And it isn't a feature with anybody that I've worked with over those years. It's about finding somewhere where they feel safe and protected. It's about people saying Scotland's given me a home, and it's about a Scottishness that resonates with them, and they see their children as being Scottish. And I think moves like, most recently, refugees having the right to vote in the Scottish Government, they're the kind of things that really solidify a Scottishness as opposed to a Britishness.
Yeah, as also not a British person, as a Maltese woman, as someone from a former British colony, in fact, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are particular policies that encourage that nationalist response that isn't progressive, but also that people, whether it's a British identity or a Maltese identity, there are, an infinite number of ways people imagine that identity. It's not just one British identity that we're speaking about. And so I would emphasize that. And I think in a lot of the work we've done, Teresa, people are actually constructing their identity in contrast to certainly the British government, certainly these migration policies. A lot of the work that's being done here in Glasgow is in contrast to that. It's saying we are not like that. We don't want dawn raids in our community, for instance.
Yeah, I guess for a question about British identity, there's two aspects. When we work with people, I don't think that's a conversation which was ever raised or it was something that we talked about, but it's about people finding their own identity and the people reserving. And showing their own identity as well, to proudly show and to represent their identity and their culture is really important for people. And I think that's where the differentiation between assimilation and integration comes from. It's not about having a group of people to integrate into a community where you lose your identity, where you lose your culture, but it's about where you learn from each other, where you have that space and where you can actually feel free to carry both identities and both cultures, or even more than both if you have, depending where you how you see it. I mean, work is another thing. When people are seeking asylum, people don't have the right to work, and it has a huge impact on people's identity, on people's future, on how they can contribute back to their communities, but also use their skills as well. And that's something we have been working on for the past few years with the Lift the Ban campaign, and in Scotland with Right to Work. Maybe just a side comment as well, over the years we do hear, when it comes to issues around politics and hearing about, well, we don't have power over this, but it's something that we need to also explore in Scotland. We shouldn't maybe sometimes bring the conversation back to independence all the time to say, you know, if we had independence, we will have the power to do better. We need to start exploring about what we can do now and how we can make the changes now, rather than having to wait.
Okay, so that was quite emphatic in its rejection of British identity, and that's really fascinating. I guess it's just the next question I have is about the future, really, about what happens after Kenmure Street, after all of the other developments and incidents that we've spoken about. What's the future for community organising and support for people who come from all sorts of different parts of the world to be here in Glasgow with us?
I think that the COVID context is one that we've not really kind of put at the foreground, but it's obviously changing so much for so many. Even just the fact that a pause on dispersal to Glasgow is very worrying, because where will people be dispersed to? And that's my worry, is talk of offshoring, barracks. This is problematic. So we have COVID context, and we also have in Priti Patel and in our current government a particularly regressive, nasty, punitive set of policies coming through that are incredibly worrying. So I think that for future organising there needs to be more. I think what we saw in Kenmure Street in the aftermath, and we see in organisations like the Anti-Eviction Network, we see some more sophisticated types of organising actually that is adapting to and responding to Home Office tactics and policies. But I think we need to be very careful and very wary about what's coming next, because we should not be surprised by anything that comes from the Home Office in terms of trying to, punish people for claiming asylum. What's really important is creating those opportunities for people to connect, because the social isolation that people have felt through COVID and the practices of neglect of people in the asylum process through COVID are really an extension of the practices of neglect they already experienced before COVID. So I'm optimistic and hopeful, but I'm very wary and cautious of the kinds of work that will need to be done in order to ensure that people feel safe and they have the opportunity to claim asylum, which is their right.
Thank you for listening to Recovering Community. If you're enjoying this new series, please subscribe and share it to your social networks. I'm Anne Kerr, and I'm grateful to Kenmure Street resident David Millar, to my colleagues Teresa Piacentini and Cetta Mainwaring, and to Pinar Aksu from the Maryhill Integration Network for joining me today. Many thanks also to the Bowling Green on Kenmure Street for hosting our conversation. The music in this episode is by the Glasgow-based Iranian musician Arif Gorbani, whose song Gule Pamchal is part of Exile Fogreich, a project by the Glasgow Barons. You also heard Welcome Home by the Maryhill Integration Network's Joyous Choir. Thanks also to staff in the School of Social and Political Sciences and the College of Social Sciences who helped with this podcast. You can find details of some of the research published around this subject in the show notes. Recovering Community is produced by Freya Hellier.